Hi everybody. Welcome to Chapter 3, The Art of Ancient Egypt. You can see here I've given you the dates for the culture. We begin our discussion of Egypt right around 3000 BCE, which is when the territory becomes unified under a single ruler, and we begin what we call the Egyptian dynasties, about 30 in all, and ending at 332 BC. Let me show you where we are. When we talk about ancient Egypt, we're talking about a culture that settles along the longest river in the world, which is the Nile River. This is an area, because it's on a river, and we've seen this before, it was a highly prized region because of its proximity to the water, and also because the Nile River flooded every year, which brought really good soil to the region and made it fertile. Originally, we really get settlements maybe between 5000 and 4000 BC. We get early primitive settlements along the river when people become to be more agriculturally inclined. And then finally we get developments of cultures along the north and southern part of the Nile, which we call Lower Egypt in the north and Upper Egypt in the south. Then right around 3000 BC, Upper Egypt conquered Lower Egypt, which is when we begin our discussion of Egyptian culture. Here are some of the major cities that we're going to be looking at. We're actually going to be looking at three specific archaeological and architectural sites at Giza, Saqqara, and at Deir el-Bahari, which you can see is to the south in Upper Egypt. That's something, by the way, that is always very confusing to me, so I know it may take a little bit of time to have it make sense. So what we're going to do with Egypt is first discuss architecture, and then we're going to look at sculpture. I'm not always going to work in a strictly chronological way, and what you're going to find out is that makes perfect sense for Egypt. Unlike some cultures like Greek culture, which we'll be looking at shortly, which develops over time, and there's a sense of artistic progress in quotes, but that art changes over a period of centuries or millennia. With Egypt, there's a remarkable amount of consistency, so that stylistic attributes get developed very, very early and remain constant throughout the period of the Egyptian Empire. So we begin here. I actually put up this image of the Rosetta Stone simply so we can discuss sort of our modern day interest in Egypt, what I'm referring to as Egypt mania, which is a phenomenon that began back in the age of Napoleon. In 1798, Napoleon who's obviously he's French, and he was at war, I believe, with the British. But he had an outpost in Egypt where Napoleon and his men had gone, but they had also brought with them about a commission of 175 non-military people, including artists, archaeologists, botanists, geographers, who were there to study the culture of ancient Egypt. You know, ancient Egypt, unlike some of the other cultures we've talked about, was never really lost. They knew about it during the Renaissance, they certainly knew about it in even earlier ancient times, but it wasn't something that was systematically studied and excavated until we get to the very beginning of the 19th century. So when Napoleon's men went, they actually ended up producing a 26-volume book on the history of Egypt. They also made a very important discovery for the study of Egypt, and something that prompted a lot of further study, which was the Rosetta Stone. What happened is Napoleon's artistic commission, this 175 men, were there working when things took a turn for the worse militarily for Napoleon, and the artistic commission was abandoned in Egypt. And the story goes that they were shoring up an old Arab fortification for protection for their own purposes, and they were moving this piece of rubble, and they found that it bore an inscription, and it turns out to be the Rosetta Stone. This is a very critically important object for ancient Egypt and for its study. Up until this discovery, hieroglyphics, which were the primary form of Egyptian writing, were not fully decipherable, which meant that a lot of Egyptian text remained opaque to us. When this text was discovered, it allowed us to crack the code of hieroglyphics. What this object is a fragment of a stele, which you've already met steles. These are public, upright stone monuments, usually with text, sometimes with text and image. Remember, we saw the stele of Hammurabi. And this one contained a public decree that was written in 196 BC and written in 3 separate languages. The top one was in Greek. The top one was in hieroglyphic. The second one was in what was called Demotic, which was a late Egyptian script. And the lower one was in Greek. And the usefulness of this was that the Greek text was fully translatable and understood. And what people soon figured out was that this was the same text repeated 3 times, and so that Greek text offered a way to translate what was previously untranslatable. So it allowed us not only to decipher this particular hieroglyphic text, but also many, many other hieroglyphic texts that were found. Now, our modern interest in Egypt is sort of pop culture in a way. I mean, there's the mummy movies for sure. But when we talk about Egypt, the first thing we need to talk about is the idea of the cult of the dead. So I'm showing you here a picture of a mummy. When I say the cult of the dead, there's a very specific meaning here. A lot of Egyptian art is based on funerary function, but it's more specific than that. There's a belief in ancient Egypt that when you die, your spirit, which is called your Ka, K-A, just a Ka, lives on, but it lives on very specifically in the body. And so the preservation of the body becomes critical for the preservation of the spirit in the afterlife. So in Egypt, they created what were called mortuary workshops. When someone died, and presumably this is somebody of importance, people of lesser rank wouldn't have the same benefit, every effort was made to preserve the body so that the Ka had somewhere to live. It was a 10-week process of mummification, where the body was cut open, when all of the organs that would have rotted were removed. They were all preserved separately and kept in what were called canopic jars, except for the heart. The heart remained in place. The brains were pulled out with a hook through the nose and were discarded. Then when all of this was removed, the body was set into a tub of natron, which is a salt, to dry it out for maybe a period of 40 days, which blackened the skin and dried it. At that point, the bodies were painted when they were removed. So men were painted a reddish tone, women a yellow tone. And then when all of this was done, the body was then covered in ointment-soaked sheets of linen, and the body would be wrapped. Sometimes as many as 50 layers of linen would be put around the body, and amulets would be put in these layers of linen to help ward off evil spirits and protect the dead. When all of this was completed, a book of the dead with about 200 spells to help protect the Ka would be placed between the legs. A funerary mask would be placed over the face, and then the body could be placed into a series of coffins. So every effort made to preserve it. There were also architectural structures that grew up around this same idea. What you're looking at above is an image of a mastaba, and this was the early practice of funerary structures for these mummies. So a mastaba is just an Arabic word that means bench, and it's a one-story, sort of sloping walled structure, usually made out of mud brick in its early days. There would be an interior chamber, which was a chapel, where people could come to make offerings to the dead. And behind that, there was a sealed-off room, which was called the serdab. And there would be a statue, which had a very important function. Statues of the dead were kept so that in case anything happened to the mummy, and that the actual body might, rot or disintegrate, the statue was an alternative home for the Ka. Okay, so a statue would be kept there in that sealed-off room, and then there would be a vertical shaft. Underneath, in the bottom of that vertical shaft, would be the actual burial ground, and this is where the mummy would be placed. Usually, even if the upper structure was built out of mud brick and was somewhat perishable, the pit down below would be lined with stone to keep out moisture, and then would usually be blocked up with either large stones or rubble infills, again as a way of keeping people out. And this was also very important because people were buried with grave goods. The belief was that you carried on your life in the afterlife, and therefore you needed everything you needed for your daily life as well for the afterlife. So people were buried with furniture, with food, with statues that functioned as servants, and with images as well. And we're going to be looking at some of these because most of what survives for ancient Egypt is funerary in nature. And again, that sticks with what I said when I talked about Sumerian art. Most of what survives is what's most important to a culture. Now this is an early, very elaborate example of a tomb monument. This is very important, okay, for the history of art and for the history of architecture. It's one of the first monumental stone structures known. So very quickly, the idea of the mastaba evolves into something with more permanence, and so stone was sought after. There was a supply of stone in Egypt, but again, it made it much more difficult to build. So this is something that's called a step pyramid, and what it was really an evolution of the idea of the mastaba. This was built for King Dozier, who was a third dynasty, which means early Egyptian pharaoh. And originally it probably was intended as a simple mastaba, but over time the idea came to stack the mastabas one on top of the other so that you have about a 6-level pyramid. We call it a stepped pyramid because you can still see those individual steps. And it now stands about 204 feet high, so a very, very large structure entirely built out of stone, limestone blocks. We know the name of the architect involved. His name was Imhotep, who was a very important individual. And you know that he's important because we know his name, and we rarely do know the name of Egyptian artists. They were not considered important. We're still talking about a period where we're not really talking about art. We're talking about things that had functional purposes. But Imhotep was a priest to the sun god Ra, which was a very important Egyptian deity. They had many deities, but Ra was the most important of them. And he was also a physician and then an architect. So Imhotep, we know from an inscription on a statue in the complex, seems to have designed the structure. Now, I just said complex. This is not just a series of stacked mastabas to create a step pyramid, but it's actually an entire complex of buildings that represent the palace of King Dozier in the afterlife. Now, let me make a note, because this is the first time we're saying the word pyramid. The idea of stacked mastabas functions in two ways. It functions symbolically, like literally a stairway to heaven, cue music. But the idea that when a pharaoh dies, he would become deified. He would join the gods, and he literally ascended the pyramid to be in the heavens with the gods, to join Ra in his solar chariot. But it also was a symbol for the god Ra. Ra was the first deity. He arises out of the primordial waters of the earth on this mound, which becomes a symbol for Ra. And so the pyramid is also a symbol of the sun god. Here you can see a sort of cutaway diagram of the step pyramid, the original mastaba underneath, and then the levels built up on top. You can see the burial shaft down below. This was a 92-foot deep burial shaft. And then the stone blockage. And I think there was something like a 50-ton stone that blocked in Dozier's body as a way of preserving it and also of preserving grave goods. I mean, this was a real risk to create something like a step pyramid, because if you know that people get buried with valuables, then to mark the site of the burial would be encouraging grave robbers. And that became a problem very, very early, even still in ancient Egyptian times. This is part of the larger complex, and now I can show it to you from above. So it's an enormous walled-in structure. There were 34-foot-high walls that surrounded the entire complex. You could see at the heart of it is the stepped pyramid. The stepped pyramid was oriented according to the sides of the compass. So in other words, there's a north face, a south face, an east face, and a west face. And you'll notice here that instead of in a mastaba where the funerary chapel is on the inside, the funerary chapel, it's number 2 on this diagram, is appended to the outside on the northern face. The idea is that there's the northern stars. We call them the northern lights. They're the stars that don't extinguish. And so that would be a metaphor for the idea of this eternal afterlife. Now, there are numerous other elements to this complex. You could see that there was what was called a South Palace, which is number 11 on your map, and then number 9, which is the North Palace, which represented Dozier's rule as ruler of northern and southern Egypt, Lower and Upper Egypt, which were united together. So he gets 2 palaces, as he might have had in his real life, so that he could continue on in this function. There are a series of courts, a very large court, on the southern side of the step pyramid, which would allow the king to carry out ceremonies and functions like he would have during his reign. He only reigned 19 years, and so this is quite an elaborate structure. There were magazines. You can see here on the western side, the long western side, labeled number 14, which are storage rooms. They found some 40,000 clay vessels here filled with goods, with oil, with wine, with food, with things that he would have needed in his afterlife. There were also sham buildings. Now, I already mentioned that people would have been looking for grave goods, and so there was a purposeful effort here to build structures so that people might be deceived as to what was important. So number 6, which you can see on the eastern long side, are sham buildings. So they were meant to look important with the idea that people would go in there looking for goods and be distracted from the real sites of the burials. Also, there's a series of doorways on all sides of this enclosure, right, that 34-foot high wall. There's 14 different entranceways, but only one of them was real, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the diagram. So again, there were efforts made to keep this as private as it could be, considering its size. And there I'm just showing you this aerial view so you can see how big it is. It's sort of an aerial view from space, but it allows you to get some sense of what the structure looked like. We call these sort of cities of the dead an acropolis. So that's the term. It means city of the dead, and they appear in ancient Egypt, and we'll see them in other cultures as well. Now, the stepped pyramid is an early pyramid, but when I say pyramid, you say Giza. These are the Great Pyramids. And they're one dynasty later. So the step pyramid was an early first pyramid. These are the Great Pyramids, which are in the 4th dynasty rather than the 3rd. And there are 3 of them in a row. And what we're looking at are 3 separate pyramids created by 3 successive rulers. So there's hereditary rule in Egypt. So this really are 3 male members of the same family who each construct pyramids for their own funerary chapels. Now you'll notice that the pyramid here has taken on its more iconic form. There's no longer the step form. Now we really do have that shape that would have reminded people of the sun god Ra and really sort of mirrored the idea of the rays of the sun. You know, when these were finished, they were covered. These are entirely built out of stone, but they were covered with very, very highly polished stone, most of which has been removed, so we no longer see it. But that would have given this almost a reflective surface. So the sun symbolism would have been even more powerful. Now we're looking at 3 pyramids, and they're actually shown to us with the largest and oldest one furthest away, which is Khufu. Then the middle one, which is slightly smaller. It actually looks larger in a lot of pictures because it's on slightly higher ground, which is Khafra's. And then the last and smallest of them, which is closest to us, which is Menkaura's. You can also see 3 very little pyramids. There were sometimes minor pyramids, which were for the wives of the pharaohs. Now, just some statistics, okay? Just so you get a sense of how big these are. I mean, this is one of the wonders of the ancient world. But Khufu's is the largest pyramid, and this is a diagram that shows, how it compares to other major monuments. Look, obviously, the Eiffel Tower is bigger. It's a 19th century steel building. But for the technology of ancient Egypt, the construction of a pyramid was a huge undertaking. To have it perfectly aligned, perfectly straight walls, and then to simply manage the logistic of moving blocks, 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks, which weighed about 2.5 tons each, with some of them weighing significantly more, up to 30-50 tons. So there were a lot of challenges in terms of construction. The largest of the pyramids is now about 450 feet high. It would originally have been higher when it had the smoothed stone facing on it. And that facing was taken off by later builders in the region, probably Arabic builders from, the 11th or 12th century, who were using it then to build medieval Cairo. So, there was actually an estimate. When Napoleon's men went, they made a fascinating estimate about the kind of amount of material used here. And they said that if you used all of the stone blocks from the pyramid, you could build a 1-foot wide, 10-foot high wall around France. Now, the construction of the pyramids is obviously a difficult undertaking, and the interiors get a little bit more complex as well. They're not fully understood. You see quite a few question marks on your diagram here, but that shows you the interior of the pyramid. There still is a funerary temple. It's no longer appended to the outside of the building or inside of it. It's been moved, and I'll show you it on the final diagram. But here on the inside, there would be probably a primary burial chamber, but there's also several abandoned burial chambers. They might be for the real burial. They might be sites that were abandoned because of stability issues. I would presume that the real burial chamber is the one that's under that weight-relieving chamber. That weight-relieving chamber is put there so that some pressure is taken off of that chamber so it doesn't collapse in on itself. But other chambers, like the one buried under the ground, was probably meant as a distraction technique, like a false chamber, so that, again, grave robbers would head in that direction rather than finding the real grave site. And by the way, this didn't work. All of these tombs, with the exception of King Tut's tomb, were pilfered long before modern times. Here you can see a sort of map of Giza. So there are the 3 separate pyramids. From left is Menkaure, then in the middle is Khafre, on the right is the oldest, which is Khufu's. Now I said the funerary temples get moved. There actually are small funerary temples attached, this time to the eastern faces of the pyramids. In Djoser's pyramid, it was on the north face. In this case, it's on the eastern face. The symbolism changes. It gets moved to the eastern face because the eastern side becomes associated with life. It's the rising sun, is the east. You know, these are built very much to the points of the compass, right? So there's a north side, a south side, an east side, a west side. The mortuary temples are on the eastern side, and then you could see they're attached by what we call a causeway, long raised platforms and walkways that led to a larger funerary temple that was detached from the pyramid. So they're thinking about north, south, east, and west, and that makes so much sense if you think about Egypt. Egypt lives with the thought of a grid. In other words, there's a north-south running river that runs their everyday life. It's very important for their survival. And then there's the east-west passage of the sun, which is symbolic of their major deity, Ra. So their awareness of that grid-like structure is evident in their architecture. Here you'll also notice that some of the pyramids, especially Khufu's, which is the earliest on the right-hand side, has not only additional wives' pyramids, but also many mastabas that were there, probably for other members of the family. You'll also see the Sphinx, which is located by Khafre's, the middle pyramid's funerary temple. The question of how they build the pyramids always comes up, and it is a really big issue, because the problem is if you're building with mostly 2.5-ton blocks of granite and limestone, you can't deadlift that weight. In other words, you can't use pulley systems to raise those stones up into their proper location. So this was a huge technical achievement. It is built along the western bank of the Nile. Like Saqqara, the western side of the Nile was associated with death because it's the setting sun. But because it's built by the Nile, the stones were usually quarried on the other side of the river, and so they would probably wait for flooding seasons so that they could move the stones more easily. They probably also used rollers on wet sand as a way of helping to facilitate moving heavy blocks like this. But how they get them up the pyramid would be a really big challenge. There was probably a system of ramps that were used and constructed, and maybe also a system of sort of rockers. In other words, what they would do is put one of these stone blocks on a stone that was carved like a semicircle, with one flat side, one curved side. And then they would rock the semicircle back and forth. And as they rocked it, they would put a shim or some sort of wedge under the raised end so that when it came back down, it would lift up a little bit. And then put a shim or a wedge under the other side. And if they did that over and over again, they could slowly move the stones up the pyramid. But it was a huge technical achievement. Later funerary structures do have some variation in style, and I wanted to show you a much later offering, but just to give you some other idea of what you could do for a funerary temple besides the pyramid. Now, the funerary temple of Hatshepsut is not her burial site per se. She's from the 18th dynasty, which is quite a bit later. We just looked at 3rd and 4th dynasty. By the time we get to the 18th dynasty, there seems to be an awareness that you don't want to put your actual burial site next to your funerary chapel, because it made it too easy to find the burial site. So Hatshepsut herself is buried over the hills in the Valley of the Kings, and this is just the temple, where there were rooms dedicated to her. Again, after you die as a pharaoh, you become sort of deified, you join the gods, as well as to two major deities, including a sun deity. Now, Hatshepsut, I said she, and she is a pharaoh. She's a great character, and there's a good story about her. Her father was a pharaoh, and her father was Thutmose I. And when he died, rule passed to Thutmose II, who was her half-brother, who then she married, in order to keep herself in that sort of ruling position. But when Thutmose II died, his next heir was Thutmose III, which was not her child, but rather a son that Thutmose II had had with a minor wife. And so she had no claim to be even near the throne, except that Thutmose III was a minor. He was a child. And so Hatshepsut, as the primary wife, was left to act as regent to the boy. In other words, she ruled in his stead, and she was supposed to hand over rule when he reached the age of majority. But she didn't. So when he became old enough to take power, she instead claimed two things. First, that her father had claimed her in the line of succession, and that she was supposed to be pharaoh. But secondly, that the gods had deemed it so. And so she kept Thutmose III for assuming the throne for maybe 3 decades until she died. And instead she ruled as a female pharaoh. Very interesting. And this is her funerary temple, which she actually built beside an earlier funerary temple of Mentuhotep, which is in the background. What she does is very different. It's not a pyramid, but it's a series of raised walkways and elevated platforms leading into the structure itself, which was carved into the face of a natural rock formation of a cliffside. She chose a very important site, which is Deir el-Bahari, because that's where, I think it was the destination site of what was called the Festival of the Wadi, which was an annual festival to celebrate the rights of the dead. So she chose a symbolic location. Now, I've said whenever you see a piece of architecture, you should think about approach. How do we approach this? And this has what we would call an axial approach. There is one way into the heart of the structure, and it's on a central axis. So you know exactly how you're supposed to engage the building. You would come up a rampway, and then you could see this elevated platform. It's very barren now, but she imported trees, and it was covered with sort of a very lush environment. And it was also covered with many over life-size statues of herself in various guises, shown as pharaoh. And then you'd go up another series of ramps where you'd enter into that colonnade. You see the series of sort of pillars, and you could see some statues decorating the face of that stone. And then enter inside, under those columns or piers, into the heart of the inner chamber. She made images along the ramps and along the interior that showed her being given rule by the gods as a way of justifying her reign. So this functions a little bit like a propagandistic work of art. What's very interesting for me for the architects, and we think the architect's name might have been Senmut, who she was rumored to be having an affair with. Not important. But you can see the way the architect took the site into account. You know, the pyramids, or the Sumerian ziggurat, and there's a lot in common there that you should think about. But the pyramids and the ziggurat are meant to be raised above their setting. They're set apart from their environment. This is meant to work with the environment. Probably smart, because you can take advantage of natural materials that are available on the site, but you can also see the way the building harmonizes with the environment. If you look at that pattern of piers across the front, where you see the light piers and then the dark shadow, that repetition along the back wall of this structure, it sort of mirrors the natural rock formations and those vertical lines or striations that you see above. So it also looks like it belongs as part of its setting. Here's a little bit of a diagram. So you can see that temple of Mentuhotep, and she sort of models it on his temple, but to a grander scale. You can also see the temple of Thutmose III. Thutmose III eventually takes over the site and destroys the images of Hatshepsut there. So we have very few images of Hatshepsut that aren't badly damaged. When he finally does gain the throne, he destroys her statues as a way of defaming her, but also in a more serious way as destroying alternate homes for her Ka. So it also functioned as a way to destroy her in the afterlife. And here's just one more aerial view where you could see the series of ramps and walkways, and then what's left of that interior structure up above. But what I want to look at for the remainder is art in sculpture. Now, we're going to look at sculpture in the round, and we're also going to look at art in somewhat of two dimensions. I'm not going to be looking at Egyptian painting with you. I have to say that I think a lot of it is problematic. A lot of painting from this period, if it does survive, has been heavily repainted. So when we talk about art in two dimensions, I'm going to be looking at relief sculpture, which has a lot of the same issues as painting does, which is that it's a roughly two-dimensional surface. So this is an object, a very famous object from early Egyptian history called the palette of Narmer. It's a makeup palette, meaning you could see on one side of it there's a round indentation, and that was used as a place where pigments, ground pigments, could be put and then applied to the eyes as a way of protecting the eyes and reflecting some light from the sun. So this is a makeup palette. You're seeing it from the front and the back. So this is two sides of the same objects. And in the upper left, I'm showing you another palette. So just so that you could see this is a type of object. The object itself, therefore, seems to be functional, except this was a very large and elaborate version of a makeup palette. And it was actually found in a temple, which means this was a votive object, like we saw for ancient Sumeria. The subject of the palette seems to be really the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. We call it the palette of Narmer because it seems to show King Narmer as being the one who unites these two separate regions under one rule. It's not difficult to find Narmer. In Egyptian art, we have the same convention we saw in ancient Sumeria, which is hierarchy of scale or hieratic scale. So Narmer is shown significantly larger than everything that surrounds him. Here, let's look at this side of the palette. You could call it the front or the back. It's the side without the makeup palette. And I've labeled some things for you so you know what you're looking at. We see Narmer, again, hieratic scale, so larger than anybody else in the image. And we also see him in what's called composite pose. Now, we've seen composite pose a little bit before in Sumeria, but let's talk about that in more detail. It's sometimes called also twisted perspective. Composite pose is when the artist shows you the most characteristic points or viewpoints of each part of the body as a way of making the form more understandable. So legs are shown from the side. It's easiest to understand a leg and a foot if you see it from a profile view. So in composite pose, we see a profile view of the legs, but we see the frontal view of the torso so that we can see more and understand more of the body. We see the profile view of the face. Profiles are the easiest way to depict the human face, but a frontal view of the eye. So it's not a natural way to examine form, but it's a way of taking a three-dimensional body and flattening it into a roughly two-dimensional form, and still allow us to have maximum understanding of what it is that we're looking at. And it becomes a convention that we see used consistently throughout Egyptian art and many other cultures. So the composite form of Narmer, as well as the man right behind him, who's shown as his foot washer, who's smaller in scale, but still actually has a little emblem over his shoulder that identifies him, so must be important enough to gain a position here. Narmer's name is written as well, right over Narmer's head, and you can see if you follow Narmer and follow that bowling pin-shaped hat up, which is the crown of Upper Egypt, you see there's a little symbol in a square, and it shows a catfish and a palette, and that phonetically spelled out Narmer's name. That image is surrounded on either side by images of a female-headed bull, which is the goddess Hathor, which protected the pharaoh. So then we see the pharaoh down below, and we see his role as conqueror. So he's lifted some sort of a mace or a club, and he's about to slay the defeated man we see down below. This idea of the pharaoh as conqueror is also represented symbolically by the image of a bird, which is symbolic of the god Horus. He's a falcon god and a sky god. And he was both the protector of the pharaoh and actually sort of the divine embodiment of the pharaoh. And here you see Hathor standing on a human-headed papyrus thicket. The papyrus thicket would have been a symbol for Lower Egypt, which was conquered. And so this is a symbol of Horus subjugating the Nile Delta. There's 6 of these papyrus stalks, and they may represent 6,000 defeated people. Then we see Narmer standing on a ground line, where we see an aerial view of 2 fallen enemies. See, the artist here isn't showing you one comprehensive view of a scene. He's showing you each view in a way that makes the most sense. So we see Narmer from the side, but when we want to see the fallen bodies, we have an aerial perspective onto them. And here you can see the opposite side. Here on that top register, and again we have the palettes divided into registers like the Warka vase, we see Narmer now wearing the northern crown. So again, this shows Narmer as ruler over both sides of Egypt, both parts, followed again by his much smaller foot washer, and he's walking in a procession where we see people carrying standards, which are trophies or flags on top of poles. And then you see the bodies of the dead laid out on the battlefield. Once again, we see Narmer and his procession from the side, but the bodies laid on the battlefield from above. In the middle register, we see the depression, where you would actually mix this green pigment called malachite for the eyes, which is created by the necks of 2 felines, these sort of fantastic feline creatures that are being pulled by men on either side. It could be a symbol for, again, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, but also for the idea of subjugating chaos. The pharaoh's job was to do the same thing that the sun deity did at the beginning of time, which was to create order out of chaos. And then finally the lowest register, where we see Narmer now in the form of a bull, conquering a city, stepping on the body of a person identified as a Libyan, and knocking down city walls. Here you can see an up-close view. I've given you your vocabulary of composite view and hierarchy of scale. There's the wonderful detail of the people laid out on the battlefields, and you can actually see that they've been beheaded and their heads are laid out between their legs. So this is where Egyptian convention is laid out. And these rules are going to be very similar everywhere we go. We're going to see composite pose used over and over again. We're going to see conventions like hierarchy of scale as a way of expressing meaning. And again, by the way, next to Narmer, you can see his name, which is that fish and that palette. So for example, if I show you a significantly later object from 5th dynasty, okay, so this is centuries later, you'll see the same basic conventions. This is called Ch3 watching a hippopotamus hunt. Now Ch3 is not a pharaoh. In the 5th dynasty there was an interesting phenomenon. It's during the 4th dynasties that the great pyramids are built, and they must have required, for a century, many, many hands, many craftsmen, builders, painters, sculptors, architects, that after the end of this great building project, there were probably a lot more trained artists than there had been. And in the 5th dynasty, we start to see upper-class people and government officials also decorating tombs for themselves. Not nearly so elaborate as pharaohs' tombs would have been, but because so many pharaohs' tombs were looted, we actually probably have more funerary art from these mid-level people as opposed to looking just at the art of the pharaohs. So this is not a pharaoh, but it's a man whose name is Ch3. And it shows Ch3 in his tomb, in the afterlife, carrying on the activities of his life, I mean, the activity of hunting, for example. So we see Ch3 standing on a boat. He's in the same pose that we saw for Narmer. We see that composite pose, so the profile legs, the frontal torso, the profile face, and the frontal eye. And we see hierarchy of scale, or hieratic scale. So he's very large compared to the other men on the boat. It all takes place in a papyrus thicket. And you could see that the artist has represented the papyrus thicket, and I'm showing you a picture of papyrus, as those vertical grooves in the relief. And then up above you can actually see the flowering branches, and you could see it's filled with animals and foxes and birds. It's an interesting subject because it actually shows us something. First of all, many sculptures in Egyptian art are painted, and so we could see the paint here, which would have made it more legible, especially inside a tomb where there's not a lot of natural light. And this shows a hippo hunt, which is probably also symbolic. Hippos, by the way, were notoriously destructive. They destroyed Egyptian crops. And so they were a symbol of chaos and also a symbol of Seth, who's a god of the underworld. And so this is also about the idea of overcoming evil forces. So Ch3 in the afterlife does not participate in the hunt, but he oversees it. He's in that very static Egyptian pose. Even in active scenes, there's a sense of static pose. The figure isn't really moving. And that may go along with the idea of this being a sort of an eternal image meant for the afterlife. Now that's not true for the other figures in the scene, and so that's another convention here. The more stiff and formal the figure is, and the more they stick to the convention of composite pose, the more important the figure is. In other words, pharaohs and important figures are shown with hieratic scale and in composite pose, while lesser ranked people can actually be shown more natural in a way and more dynamic. So while Ch3 stands there in that composite pose, the men who are actually hunting, these sort of servants, are dynamic and moving, and there's a lot more attention to their body and the way people move. And so that shows you that there's a certain status given to this very formal way of showing the body. Now I'm showing you a very peculiar object from your textbook. I'm just showing you a detail of it, and it's called the stele of the sculptor Ch3. And the reason that your book included this, it makes a lot of sense. It's to illustrate the idea of the Egyptian grid. Now, when Egyptian artists made the human body, they used a very specific convention of the grid. In other words, if I say to an Egyptian artist, make a human figure, they're not just going to start from scratch, they're not going to go look at bodies from nature, they're going to start with a grid, because there was a system for showing the ideal body that all Egyptian artists followed from the earliest times in Egypt to the latest. They created a grid based on a unit which was made by the width of the palm, or the width of the fist. They make that one unit, and then they would create a grid made up of 18 units high. And then on that grid, the body, different parts of the body would be aligned to different parts. So the knees were at the 5th square. The navel was at the 11th square. The elbows were at the 12th square. The shoulders were at the 16th square. The hairline was about the 18th square. And that was the convention that was used here. And so this, I'm showing you this picture. This is supposed to be an unfinished grave stele. So a stele is a sort of public upright stone slab, but it's unfinished so we can see the grid as the artist was carving it. This is done in what's called sunken relief, which means it's relief, but the artist is actually carving the figures into the surface of the stone, rather than leaving the figures raised and carving the background away. I say this is a weird object because I don't believe that this object is authentic. It seemed peculiar to me that there was an unfinished grave stele that survived, that didn't get destroyed over time, that somehow was miraculously preserved from what is thought to be a sculptor's workshop. Ch3, we assume, is the guy who's making it and then must die while he's working on it. I actually then did a little bit of research, which is a good thing to do. I went to the British Museum site to find out where it was gotten from. In other words, I was checking on what's called provenance. Where did it come from, and how do we know it's authentic? And the provenance of it is terrible. It was gotten from a private collector who was basically a dealer who traveled to Egypt in the 1830s and came back with an assortment of objects of unknown origin. So what we're looking at may very well be a modern forgery, but it's valuable insofar as it at least demonstrates the concept of the grid, which is real. Now, for Egyptian art, I mostly want to spend the rest of this time looking at sculpture in the round, because again, this was very important. It was sculpture in the round that provided the home for the Ka. And the good thing again about Egypt is that there are conventions. There are a certain way that things are done. And so Egyptian figures are usually shown in one of 7 poses, 6 of which I'm showing you here. But again, there's not a wide variety of choices for the artist. There were a certain number of set poses to choose from, and that ideal body fit into that. The most common is the standing, left foot advanced, hands clenched at the side. There are seated figures, very often pharaohs. Kneeling figures, where you would see the figure kneeling and holding what were called nu jars, N-U, which were offering jars, so it's a votive figure. The scribe pose, which was not for pharaohs, it's for less important figures, which were shown seated, legs crossed. scroll in the lap. The block pose, which you would see simply like the block of the body, almost as if it's somebody with like their shirt pulled over their bent knees, and then just a head or a portrait on top. And finally, the mummy pose, which is a shrouded figure with the arms crossed over the body. If it's a ruler, they'd be holding a crook and a flail. There is one other pose. I said there were 7, but it's not one I've usually seen. It's a crouching figure with the hand to the mouth, and since I've got no good examples of it to show you, I'm going to skip that for now. But I'm going to show you several of these poses, especially the first 4 of them, in greater detail. Now, if I put this up, we can start thinking about what it is that the Egyptian figure does. So this is that first pose. Hands clenched at the sides into fists. They're holding objects which are usually identified as scrolls. This is of a husband and wife, so a male and female figures. He's a pharaoh, and we can see that by the headdress, by the false beard, and by the costume. They're walking, more or less, left foot forward. I say more or less because they're not truly walking. There's no weight shift in the body the way you would have if you were walking, but the foot is advanced. Looking at this, you can see certain things. First of all, that the sculptor very much intended for this object to last, and that very much befits the function. If it's very important that this object last for eternity because it's the alternate home for the Ka, then the sculptors made every effort to have this statue last a very long time. Therefore, nothing is cut free. It's not cut free through the legs. In between the 2 figures is a solid block of stone, so much so that you don't need to walk around to the back of the figure. It's just a stone slab. The arms are attached to the body. The heads, which are fragile because of the necks, are thickened by the hair and the headpiece to make it more stable. So there are many things that are done here to ensure that it's preserved. This is an unfinished work of art, so you can see that on the base, it's a very rough surface, and it probably would have been finished to a full polish like you see up top, and then given an inscription, but that's missing. Now, I mentioned the full polish, and that's an important point. You can see that high shine in the stone, and that usually is a sign that this is a very hard stone that was used. And it was, and again, because the artist is interested that this last a long time, very strong material was used for that reason. Now let's see who they are. Here you can see them. This is Menkaura and his queen. Menkaura was the owner of the smallest of the 3 pyramids, and this was discovered beneath his valley temple by his pyramid. It was moved from its original site. It probably would have been in the valley temple, again as one of these Ka statues, but it was thrown aside when it was plundered and thrown into a pit. The material itself wouldn't have been valuable enough for looters to take, and so it was uncovered only in 1910, and here you can see it before it was even taken out of the ground. So a husband and wife team. He's given priority because he maintains that strict Egyptian pose with the hands at the side while she embraces him. His foot advances further than hers, but she is included in the scene, which suggests a certain amount of status on her part. They otherwise look quite similar. She's wearing a wig that sort of mimics his headdress. The Egyptian body is not shown nude. Pharaohs were not shown nude. If a figure was nude, it was a sign of defeat. And so even though there's an interest in the body, her clothes are sheer, you can still see the clothing on top. It is an ideal body, too. This is not a portrait, but it's meant to be an ideal physical type to represent an idea of kingship. So no matter how old he was when he died, he's shown as a perfect athletic ideal rather than how he might actually appear. These would have been painted a lot like the Ch3 relief, but the paint gets lost over time. And in fact, maybe this one wasn't painted simply because it was finished hastily. But here's an example of another statue found at Giza of a husband and wife pair, which are shown painted. Male figures were usually painted with red pigment, females with a yellowish pigment, just like they painted their mummies, so that the color was a way of indicating gender. Now, I mentioned that the figures are not quite walking. These are bilaterally symmetrical figures, meaning if you drop a line, a central axis, through each one of these figures, they're quite symmetrical on the left and right-hand side of the body. So it's a certain perfect form. It's not meant to be transitory. This is meant to show the figures in eternity. here you can see an example of that, right? So there's the line drawn through. So even though he's got 1 foot forward, when you walk, you shift your weight. Here you don't see that. The shoulders are on a perfect plane, the hips are on a perfect plane, and the knees are on a perfect plane, which suggests, again, stability rather than something that's meant to be seen truly as in motion. And that's a convention for many freestanding Egyptian statues, including one I'm showing you on your right, which we're going to talk about next. This is a seated figure, but a lot of the same conventions apply. The figure is a youthful ideal type. It's not a portrait. These are 2 different men, and yet they have the same face. Royal status is shown by costume, the false beard, the headdress, but the body is perfect and ideal. Both of these are carved to last, as well as having the bilateral symmetry. And now we're going to look at the image on the right in a little bit more detail. And here we can see this other statue now by itself and from a variety of angles. This is a statue of Ch3. So Ch3, remember, is the owner of that middle pyramid at Giza. So this was actually found in the same site. It's the same dynasty. And Ch3 is a relative to Menkaura, slightly a little bit earlier. And this statue is in that second very common pose for royalty, which is the seated pose. Like the standing pose, it is bilaterally symmetrical, but there's a little bit of variation. Of course, the figure's seated. And in the other statue, the one real break in the symmetry was the advanced foot. And here it's the placement of the hands. So one hand is flat on the knee, and the other hand is raised in a fist and holding again that same cylindrical object, which we assume is a scroll. So, as I said, quite a few similarities already, which we don't really need to discuss much further. Certainly, by the way, just to make the point again clearly, because you could see it from this angle, you can see that this was built to last, that's a primary concern. The legs are attached to the chair, and you could see he's seated on a lion-headed throne. You can see the little face and legs. The chair underneath is not cut through. So again, nothing here is done to undermine the stability of the object. It's also meant to be seen primarily from a frontal point of view, but you'll see there's a little bit of a difference here as well. Now, this was made out of a very precious material. The Menkaura is more like it's a hard stone like a slate, and probably is meant to be painted because the stone itself is not that attractive. But this was made from what's called diorite gabbro gneiss. It's otherwise been called anathorsite gneiss, which was a really special stone. It was imported from about 400 miles away, which means that for the pharaoh to use this in his funerary statue, it suggested that he had a lot of money and also had the power to procure that kind of material. It had a very special property. You can see the photograph from your book on the right, which is not the ideal photograph, because one of the properties of this stone is that when it was exposed to natural sunlight rather than artificial lighting, it had a sort of glowing property. It glows a sort of brilliant blue. And you can see a little hint of that if you look at the image on the left of it in its museum. But that suggests that this was meant to go in the Valley Temple, and then in fact the Valley Temple may have had an open rooftop, which allowed sunlight to strike the statue. That would have had, besides being optically quite spectacular, symbolic meaning. Obviously, we know that the pharaoh associates himself with the sun deity, so the fact that this stone has a certain solar property to it in that it glows in sunlight would have been relevant. Also, it would have glown blue, which was a royal color. So it would have had symbol for Ch3 as pharaoh as well. So, as we've said, quite a few similarities that I don't need to overly elaborate on here in terms of the bilateral symmetry, the fact that it's made to last, the treatment of the body as being ideal. And this body, like the body on those relief sculptures that we looked at, the Palette of Narmer and that sculpture Usurwer Stele, was built according to the ideal Egyptian grid. So this too would have been built according to a very regular system that had nothing at all to do with what the pharaoh actually looked like. Now, there is something extraordinary about this particular statue. You can kind of see it as you begin to walk around him. I mentioned with Menkaura that the statue really has one ideal viewpoint, which is fully from the front. From the back, it's a relief sculpture, so there's really nothing to see from the back except a slab. This is a statue, however, that suggests 2 primary points of view. One from fully frontal, where it's bilaterally symmetrical, and then from a side view where we can see additional details that aren't evident from the front. 2 of them, really. One of them is the relief on the side of the block, under the throne. So you can see there's a carved image. It's the same on both sides. And what it shows is an entwined lotus and papyrus plant, which was meant to signify the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt again, but suggests that you need to see this statue from the side to fully understand its meaning, which means you need to walk around it in space. That gives you some indication as to where it might be placed in a temple. Then, we see more importantly, a little ledge off the back of the statue, the top of the throne, where we see an image again of Horus. And again, Horus is associated with the pharaoh, and here we actually see Horus protecting the pharaoh, an image you cannot see from a fully frontal viewpoint. And one that has obviously religious and symbolic meaning, but again, one that suggests how we're meant to look at it. When I send you guys to the Met and to museums, I want you guys to think about, when I ask you about the installation of a statue and I say, where would this have been seen? Those are the kind of things I want you to think about. You see the statue in a museum in Cairo, and there's no indication of how you were meant to view it, but by looking at details of the statue, you can get some indication of where you would place this so that every detail done by the sculptor gets maximum effect. As a side note, it also serves to strengthen the statue in a notoriously vulnerable spot, which is the head. Here, in a rather crummy old black and white photograph, you can see it fully from the front and fully from the sides. You can see additional inscriptions on the top of the base by the figure's feet. And what's interesting about this is that I can make a point about how Egyptian sculptors work, which is that Egyptian sculptures tend to sort of respect the block. So you give them a block of stone, and what they would have done is drawn the image, drawn the figure from the front on one side of the block, drawn the image from the side on another side of the block, drawn an image from the other side on the other side of the block, and on the back of the block. So it's really the idea of taking a two-dimensional drawing and putting it on four sides of the block. And then the artist carved away at those four sides until they sort of meet and have to be sort of resolved and integrated. In other words, the image that your book shows you of the statue at what we call a three-quarter view, where you see some of the front and some of the side, is not an Egyptian viewpoint. They're really thinking of side view or profile view, not the three-quarter view. So these are the two primary viewpoints. By the way, that is probably the result of what you might notice in these statues, which we would call an archaic smile. In ancient Greek art, it's called an archaic smile. I'm using the same term here. Which that you'll notice that the face has a little small smile. Right? A little bit of expression in the mouth. And one of the explanations for that is not that this is a happy figure, he's happy in the afterlife, but rather that what you're looking at is that when you draw a face from the front, you draw the two eyes, the nose, the mouth. When you draw it from the side, you need to do the same thing. And therefore, when you reconcile it, you end up with the archaic smile. And I've mentioned that once before, but it bears reiterating here because you can see it quite clearly on the statue of Khafra. This is another one of the types of the statue, and I figured I would just show this to you briefly. It's a kneeling statue. It's of the kneeling type with the figure holding new jars as an offering. So it's a votive figure, usually occurring at temples, and it is of Hatshepsut. So I thought I would show that to you for that reason as well. On the left, I've shown you three other images of Hatshepsut so that you could see that Hatshepsut made a lot of images of herself. She had a big propaganda sort of motive. The fact that she usurped the throne, in essence, required that she create a lot of images to justify her rule. So we see her as Sphinx, we see her in the standing pose, which is a traditionally male pose, we see her in the seated, enthroned pose, and here on the right we see her in the pose, the kneeling pose with the new jars. This is in the Met, and I just want to show it to you, first of all, to make a statement about condition. When I send you to museums, I also ask you to look at the condition of objects, and that's essentially what we are going to do with this statue. When you look at an object, you have to realize that very few things survive intact. And Hatshepsut's statues were notoriously damaged. So that, Thutmose took a baseball bat, essentially, to her statues to destroy her Ka. And so this has been very heavily restored. What you're looking at, you can see where there's the pattern in the stone. It's a granite. And you could see the reddish and blackish flecks in the stone. It looks like a countertop. And then you can see the other spots which are a little bit indented and flatter and duller in color. All of that dull color is reconstruction. Okay, so this has been very badly reconstructed. There's not much else I need to say about it. It has the same features, the ideal body, interestingly, the ideal male body. She very often showed herself fully male. Sometimes she has breasts, sometimes she doesn't, but sometimes she would be shown with just the royal kilt, no shirt, no breasts, and wearing the false beard, again because she was trying to fit her image into the male iconography of rule. We just saw Hatshepsut's Sphinx, so I might as well show you the Great Sphinx. And again, this is something I don't want to spend a terrible amount of time on, but I suppose in the standard Egyptian poses I could have thrown in a Sphinx, because that was somewhat common for rulers to show themselves, in a sense, as composite creatures. The Great Sphinx is part of the Giza complex, and in fact was situated right next to Khafra's, the Middle Pyramids, funerary temple, the Valley Temple. We don't actually know if this was meant to go with Khafra's pyramid or with Khufu's. Khufu's was the first pyramid built, and the Sphinx may have been built as a guardian to his complex, but ultimately because of its arrangement and because of the placement of Khafra's Valley Temple, we associate it with Khafra. But it could be either one of them. It does have a sort of head of a pharaoh on the top, and not a portrait head. It doesn't look like any one figure, so there's no way to tell from looking at it who it's meant to depict. But here, shown as a composite creature, shown with the body of a lion, the feet of a lion, even though it's wearing the royal headdress. We've seen composite creatures before. The Lamassu is a composite creature. The images outside the Mycenaean citadel were likely composite creatures with one kind of head on a different kind of body. In this case, it's meant to be symbolic. It turns it into a guardian figure, and we've seen the concept of the guardian figure now in several different cultures. We saw that certainly in Assyrian, in Mycenaean. We'll see it again. But also because it was a way of showing the strength of a pharaoh, to combine the human head, which is sort of a site of intelligence. Even though they did remove the brains when they mummified people, the heart was thought to be a seat of intelligence. But it gets a human head, and it gets an animal's body to show the strength of the animal. So that's one of the functions. It actually proved to be a sort of physical guardian to the site, not just a sort of magical guardian, but it was a physically threatening image. It's 65 feet high. And it was actually built out of a rocky knoll. The sculptors didn't start from scratch just putting blocks on the ground. They used a natural outcropping of rock on the site and then built around it, so they took advantage of what was there. I'm distracted by the garbage can between his legs. That's sort of sad. When they started excavating the pyramids at Giza, the Sphinx was covered in sand up to the neck, just to show you how much excavation needed to be done. In terms of sculpture, I don't need to say much more about it. It's bilaterally symmetrical, so there's a lot of commonalities in terms of style. But the plain fact is that this is a monumental sculpture. We know monumental sculptures exist in a lot of cultures. They don't often survive. And they're rarely done with the same sort of fine carving as you would see in a smaller sculpture. Simply because of the size, you lose a lot of detail. And so it's not perhaps the most exciting sculpture to look at, in addition to the fact that it's been very badly weather-worn, and it suffered some damage. There's always different stories circulating about what happened to the Sphinx's nose. The answer is we don't know. I don't think they were shot off by Napoleon, but it's been suggested Napoleon's men did it. Also Hitler's men, also 12th century Muslim rulers. Lots of suggestions about how the Sphinx's nose got lost, and in plain fact it could have just been an accident of time. It would have also been covered with a facing of fine marble, white marble on the top and then red granite around the base, but those have been stripped away. Now this is an example of another pose that I wanted to show you, which is the seated pose, the scribe pose. Now, this is not a pharaoh, and this pose wasn't used for pharaohs, but it suggests somebody of high rank, and certainly somebody who was literate. Usually a government official. And this is a seated scribe. It's 5th dynasty. That's the same dynasty as the tomb of Ch3. And you remember I said that in the 5th dynasty you get a lot more high-ranking but non-royal people commissioning funerary statues, and that's what this was. We think his name is Kai. It was found near a tomb by a man of that name. And you'll see a lot of differences. There are similarities. Even though it's in the seated scribe pose, there's bilateral symmetry. It's fully frontal. You can see the archaic smile. It's painted stone. But there are differences. This work is much smaller in scale than the other works we've seen, so there's a certain hierarchy of scale suggested. It's only 21 inches high. And there's a hierarchy of material. It's not incredibly fine stone. It's painted limestone. So the material itself, the stone is very hard and durable, but it was painted to make it more attractive. But the sculptor here isn't even carving the figure in a way so that it would last forever. You didn't see that same concern for durability that you see in Khafra's statue, for example. The arms are cut free. There's more space under the knees. The neck is left quite vulnerable, which suggests that that wasn't as big of an issue for a non-royal figure. There's also another point to be made here, which is that that idea of the ideal body, showing pharaohs who may have died when they were 50 years old as if they were 18-year-old athletes, was also a certain sort of hierarchy of style. Just like I said, figures that are shown more stiff and in more rigorous composite pose tend to be higher in rank than those that are more natural. Those that are shown with those perfectly artificial ideal bodies are also higher in rank than those that are shown in this manner. So this figure does not have an ideal body. The face shows age. He's got sunken cheeks, a much more specific face than we see in Khafra or Menkaura. The body is soft and fleshy. The stomach sags. So again, he can be shown in maybe a more natural way and a less ideal way because he is non-royal. That said, I'm not sure this is any more of a portrait. People have noticed the discontinuity between the head and the body, that the face looks sort of older and gaunt with the hollow cheeks, but the body is soft and fleshy and a little flabby. So this may too be embedded with meaning. Like this may suggest something that he's shown flabby and soft. It might be a statement about the rank of the scribe. Scribes' lives were considered to be good lives because they didn't have to work with their bodies and they worked with their hands and with their mind. They were very valued in Egyptian society and they were trained because their job was to copy sacred texts over and over again. It was a skill very few people had. So that soft body may not be K's body. It may simply be a way of expressing that he had this privileged lifestyle. The eyes, just so you notice, are made out of different material. They're rock crystal, and so they have a certain sheen to them. They almost look like light penetrates the eye as if they're looking. So the eyes have a very sort of interactive quality with the viewer. Here you can see him from a slightly different angle, and you can see the way that he's cut through on the arm. He's holding, by the way, a scroll unfurled that looks an awful lot like the cylinder that we see in the hands of Khafra and Menkaura. And he would have held a pen or a quill of some sort, but that's been missing. It was probably made out of metal and insetted separately. Now, I mentioned the fact that most of Egyptian art is terribly consistent, but I do want to mention one blip in style in what was called the Amarna period. This is a colossal statue of a man named Akhenaten. Right? Akhenaten is a pharaoh, usually from right around the 18th dynasty, but now I'm not too sure. Akhenaten's name was not originally Akhenaten. His name was Amenhotep IV. Pharaohs often took the name of gods as part of their own names. So one of the major gods was Amen, so he was called Amenhotep IV. But Akhenaten is what he becomes. Amenhotep made the decision to change the state religion from the polytheistic religion where many gods were worshipped, even if there were more and less important gods, to a single monotheistic religion where one god was worshipped, and his name was Aten, A-T-E-N, and therefore he changes his name to Akhenaten to show his worshipping of this new deity. I think it was a political move. It was a way to undercut the power of the priests, but it was a radical move. He upsets the state religion, he changed the state capital, he moves it, and then he has to build all these new temples to the new state religion and make all of these images of himself to promote it. So this is an image of Akhenaten from one of his temples, a colossal figure. So the remaining portion is 13 feet high, so it's much larger than the statue of Menkaura we looked at or than the statue of Khafra. Made out of sandstone and would have been painted. So very traditional in terms of material and traditional in terms of several things. It has bilateral symmetry. Certainly, this was meant to be a statue that the Ka could inhabit, if need be, and it's in one of the standard poses, which is the mummy pose, with the hands crossed over the body, holding a crook and a flail, if you could see the flail there, which are symbols of imperial authority. He's wearing actually a double crown on his head to show himself as the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, with the traditional cobra on the front and the false beard. So many things are common, and yet when you look at Akhenaten, you notice that he is atypical, and that the art of this period, which we call the Amarna period, is a little bit different. The body is not ideal in the same way that Menkaura's is. His waist is very narrow, his shoulders are broad, his hips are broad. He's got a soft, fleshy abdomen. He's got elongated proportions and a very elongated face and neck. The arms are rather slender. In other words, it's not the proportions the way that we're used to seeing them in almost every other Egyptian figure, and we have to ask ourselves why. It's been suggested that perhaps Akhenaten had some sort of illness, some sort of physical ailment that made him look this way, a more feminized figure, which is how we usually consider it to be because of the width of the hips and the softness of the abdomen. I suggest, however, that what we're probably looking at is a stylistic choice that was meant to suggest meaning, like so many choices in art objects are. Aten, which he worshipped, was not shown in animal form or human form as some deities were. He was actually shown as a disk. It was a sexless sun disk. And Aten was thought to be a sort of like a fertility deity, and therefore embodied elements of the male and the female in one, and in itself had no one specific gender. And so the thought is that Akhenaten may have purposely taken on feminine characteristics as a way of demonstrating this idea, of showing his association and his embodiment of the deity, and the fact that he too is deified after he dies. He is the only being on earth that speaks for Aten. Right? And so that may be the reason that we see him with these soft, feminized features. Even though we tend to want to think it looks more natural. And in fact, if you look at his face, he's got more specific features. We have pronounced lips and a sort of a long nose with a bulbous tip. They're not generic features. So even though this is not probably what he looks like, there maybe is a slightly greater tendency towards naturalism in this period. Here you can see it a little bit closer up. And you can see those details of the very specific face, as well as all those little cartouches, which are inscriptions that are worn on the garments and on the cuffs around the wrist, which would have given us further information about Akhenaten and his relationships to the deities. Now, by the way, we are always finding mummies. And in fact, not that long ago, there were discoveries of mummies in a tomb site that had been broken into and then sealed back up. So the site was disturbed, grave goods were gone, but the mummies were still there laying intact, including the wife of Akhenaten, who was a very famous woman and probably one of the only Egyptian figures that you might know her name, which was Queen Nefertiti, who might be the mummy that we see on the right. And this is a bust of Nefertiti. The image up on the top left is actually a reconstruction that was done on the mummy to show us the likeness of her features. And she actually comes quite close to this image that we're looking at here, which is a famous bust of Nefertiti. Now, let me start by saying that this image shows a lot of the characteristics of the Amarna period. And again, she's the wife of Akhenaten. We see, for example, the elongated proportions, the very long, slender neck, the elongated face. We see a little bit maybe more of a tendency towards naturalism. She looks like a specific person. And again, if that reconstruction is to be believed, she actually looked quite a bit like the mummy, like the woman herself. All of that said, I have a lot of issues with this object. I've always been suspicious about it. The story is, this is a bust, and we don't see generally busts in Egyptian art. A bust is a statue that it's not a broken statue, but it's a purposely fragmented body, usually where you just see the head and shoulders, sometimes a little bit of the upper body of a figure, and then that's the complete figure. No body was ever intended, no hands, no arms, no legs. They don't exist in Egyptian art. There's no such thing as a bust in Egyptian art, and so this is a very unique object. The explanation for its existence was that it's said to have been found in a sculptor's studio. The sculptor's name was Thutmose, and that Thutmose had made this as a template for his workers. So consider the fact, as I said, that when Akhenaten changed the state religion, he needed to make a lot of statues as propaganda, right, to spread messages. And that meant not only him, but of his wife, and she seemed to have held a significant rank within the culture. So this would have been a model that was made so that workmen in Thutmose's studio could produce images of Nefertiti. It shows what her face looks like from the front and profile view. It shows a characteristic headdress. And it shows the way he wanted the eyes to be inset. You notice she has one eye inset, and the other eye is blank. You can just see a green blob. And then the explanation for that is not that the eye was broken or missing, but that it was never finished. And that's because it only needed one eye, because it was a demonstration. The same reason she didn't need a body. It was only intended as a prototype from which to make more busts. That story bugs me. I don't know how we know we have an Egyptian sculptor's studio. And again, it's such an atypical object that there's no other parallel for it that I know of in Egyptian art. So again, I did a little bit of research, and all you have to do, go online and Google it. Type in Nefertiti bust, just into Google. That's all you need to type. And you'll find articles of many people who doubt the authenticity of this object that didn't come from a secure archaeological context. So again, we can't date it to a very specific hole in the ground. If you find a statue in a hole in the ground, you can date the other elements in the dirt at the same level, and you can sometimes come up with a date for at least when the statue was buried. We don't have anything like that for this statue, which leads me to believe that we might be looking at a 20th century forgery, maybe late 19th. I forget the date it was discovered. But that may be one of the reasons why we're so struck with Nefertiti. She really embodies a modern sense of beauty. She was noted to be as beautiful as a lotus flower, and here you could see the artist sort of plays on that notion. She's got the long, slender neck, and then the big bloom of the head. Lotus blossoms were thought to have grown, they grow in the mud and the muck, and yet they're pure. So that was a way to maybe symbolically show her. So just as an idea, and again, I'm asking you this class to think about objects that are not necessarily genuine. I've raised that issue several times during the course of this semester, so I want to at least keep you aware of when there's a famous object that offers us some problems. The last thing I want to show you, and without talking too much about it, quite frankly, is the one tomb that was discovered intact so that we could actually see what grave goods looked like. The archaeologist Howard Carter had been working in Egypt for maybe 2 decades before he came upon Tut's tomb. He'd been excavating in the Valley of the Kings by Deir al-Bahari, right? This is where, this is right near Hatshepsut's funerary temple and where she would have been buried. All of the royal tombs at that site had been looted long before modern times, despite everybody's best efforts. And Howard Carter had been there, and he had gone through all the tombs. And what's interesting is we have really good Egyptian records of the lineage of pharaohs. And so he was still looking for the tomb of one pharaoh whose tomb had never been found, which was that of King Tutankhamun. Now, Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten. Not Nefertiti's son. I think Akhenaten's son with a minor wife. And he, by the way, reverted the state religion back to an older tradition. So he abandoned the Amarna period. And therefore he took the name Amun back as part of his name. So he changed his name to Tutankhamun to show his belief in the old religious tradition, right? In the old polytheistic religion. Carter had been looking for his tomb. And in 1922 he revisited a site he'd already looked at and determined that they were workmen's huts. So in other words, there were sites of workmen's shelters in the Valley of the Kings, where people had to work and preserve the sites and also build. So he was excavating, and at one point he finds a staircase, and at the bottom of the staircase, a walled-in door. After excavating through this chamber, and then I believe into another, he finally breaks into the burial chamber of the boy king, Tutankhamun, who's now the most famous of all the pharaohs, though he died at a very young age. There was actually another forensic investigation of Tutankhamun's body just very recently. Go Google news search Tutankhamun and you usually can find out some information. There was a debate about the ethics of whether or not we should be doing all this DNA testing on his body and all this invasive medical testing. We always are interested in what killed him. It's an interesting debate. You should look a little bit of it up when you can. This just gives you some idea of what grave goods looked like. Some small idea. He was found buried. The tomb, by the way, had been broken into, and some things were out of place, but the grave robbers must have been caught because nothing seems to be missing. He was found with golden furniture and chariots and all sorts of gold grave goods, including 3 separate coffins that increasingly got more elaborate as you moved inwards, so that the innermost coffin, which you're looking at here, was actually made out of solid gold, weighing, 243 pounds of gold, so an enormous expense, and covered with precious and semi-precious gems. He's in the mummy pose, so a pose a lot like Akhenaten's, right? Bilaterally symmetrical, arms crossed over the chest with the crook and the flail to show his rule, and he's got all the other insignias of rule. The headdress with the cobra, the false beard, and in fact, inscribed, etched into the surface, are images that relate to the old religion. So again, he was meant to show himself as part of that older tradition, and so there's images that relate to Isis and Osiris on the front. So I just wanted to show this to you, and also to show you that not even was he just put inside this coffin, but he was also given a funerary mask, as most mummies were. That's the funerary mask. Again, gold, there's another 25 pounds of gold with glass and semi-precious stones. Look, you can see a little bit of the tradition here and the way actually the Amarna period affected Egyptian art. So yes, it's still bilaterally symmetrical. There's still an idealization to the face, although he died young, so the youthful quality of the face is actually fitting here. And maybe in Tutankhamun we see the traces, the remnants of the Amarna period in a little bit more specificity in the face. The mouth is a little bit more portrait-like. They're not the same generic features maybe as we saw on other images. But again, we have to assume that they're very, very much idealized. And so that's where we're going to leave Egypt. When we come back next, we'll be moving on to the next unit. And just to remind you, we're getting closer to our first exam. So if you haven't yet, go back and start reviewing where we started off last chapter so that these things become a little bit more familiar to you as we go forward. Okay? I'll see you next unit.